War is probably the greatest sickness caused by the desire for wealth and power. Government, with its team of brainwashed assassins on hand, is involved in the ultimate form of self-preservation, and as long as the resources of the world remain hoarded and restricted for the material benefit of a few, this pattern of war will never end. Now, these classifications of corruption are only a generalized grouping. Vast nuances of human behavior and everyday life are also very much poisoned by this mechanism for profit. For if you look closely enough, you will see that nearly every act of strategic monetary gain is corrupt by its very construct. It is just accepted as normal by the conditioned culture. And 4. Fiscal manipulation. The currency used today is fiat, which means its value comes essentially from government decree. Monetary value in the fiat system is actually derived from how much money is in circulation within an economy, generally speaking. Just as with any natural resource, the more money that is in circulation, the less each unit of fiat currency is worth. When less money is in circulation, it makes each unit worth more respectively. This phenomenon could be called inflation and deflation, generally speaking. Now, the increase in the supply of money available in an economy is called monetary expansion, while a decrease in the supply of money is called monetary contraction. Generally speaking, the expansion period is usually associated with so-called economic growth, for more money is available and able to be put to use, and often more jobs are thus created. Conversely, monetary contraction is often called a recession or depression, for money is drying up, and hence there is less money to put to use, so jobs are lost and companies fail. Economic growth is typically defined as the increase in the amount of the goods and services produced by an economy over time. However, let it be understood that economic growth is really a zero-sum game. There is no such thing as true economic growth in and of itself, for the underlying mechanism is based almost entirely on the amount of liquidity or money in the system. In other words, if I counterfeit $100 million and give it to you to start a business, and you buy and fix up an old building, hire a team of employees, and start to produce a product that the public buys, this would be considered an expansion of the economy. You have invested in real estate, increased the employment rate, and created new products that others buy, therefore exciting the circulation of currency, hence the consumption cycle. Now, what if the authorities found out that all the money you had used was actually counterfeit, and thus they shut down the whole operation? This would be a contraction of the economy, for the money thus vanishes. Your employees would be laid off, the building foreclosed upon, and the production halted. One should ask, what was the real growth? If the increase or expansion in the supply of money can result in the creation of jobs and production, while the decrease or contraction results in the loss of jobs and production, what exactly was gained and lost? What was the point? Let's now consider how money is created and regulated by the government and its central bank. For this example, we will use the United States and its central bank, the Federal Reserve. The expansion and contraction of the money supply is what really creates the so-called business cycle you hear about in classic economics. This cycle is largely controlled and manipulated by the central bank by way of interest rates. An interest rate is a fee charged to a borrower for the use of credit, or an amount of money. All money in the U.S. economy and virtually every other economy in the world is created out of debt through loans. Every dollar in someone's wallet is borrowed from the banking system. This is important to understand. All money is created out of debt. Thus, the rate by which the money comes into existence depends on how much a person is willing to pay in interest to acquire that loan. The commercial banks base their interest rates on values set by the central bank. When the Federal Reserve lowers its interest rates, so do the commercial banks, and credit or borrowing becomes less expensive. When the Fed raises its rates, credit becomes more expensive, and hence borrowing slows. The point here is that the Federal Reserve has the power to influence the interest rates of all banks. This translates into the power to control the amount of money being borrowed and hence the amount in circulation, and, to a certain degree, control over the growth periods and recession periods known as the business cycle. Why does the Fed need to control this? It basically comes down to controlling debt and inflation. If the money supply was allowed to constantly increase or expand, it is simply a matter of time before the market becomes saturated with excess liquidity, stifling the resulting economic growth. This will lead to inflation, depreciating the value of the currency, raising prices. Likewise, since outstanding debt is directly proportional to the money supply because money is created out of debt, the more an economy expands, often the greater the debt that is created. This sets up an inevitable systemic crisis, for the money needed to pay the interest charged on the loans does not exist in the economy outright. Therefore, there will always be more outstanding debt than money in existence. And once the debt grows larger than a person or company can afford, defaults begin, loans slow, and the money supply begins to contract. This particular scenario of debt overpowering and nullifying expansion could be termed financial failure, very simply. And this leads us to the next section. In this section, we will discuss the nature and ramifications of the current worldwide economic collapse and how it has been compounded by the gross selfishness and social irresponsibility of the government and corporate powers. Then, more profoundly, we will discuss the role technology is having in displacing workers and the powerful changes this phenomenon is going to force in the world economy at large. 1. Beyond irresponsibility. The collective external debt of all the governments in the world is now about $52 trillion, according to the CIA's World Factbook. Of the roughly 203 countries in the world today, only 4 do not owe others money. The United States alone has over $12 trillion of this debt as of January 2009. And a study authorized by the U.S. Treasury in 2001 found that in order to keep servicing the debt at its current rate of growth, by 2013, income taxes would need to be raised to 65% of one's income. The whole world is basically bankrupt. But how? How can the world as a whole owe money to itself? Obviously, it's all nonsense. The monetary system is nothing more than a game. Those in positions of social power alter the rules of the game at will. The nature of those rules are guided by the same competitive, distorted mentalities that are used to compete in everyday monetary life. Only this time the game is rigged at its root to favor those who actually run the show. For example, if you have $1 million and put it into a CD at 5% interest, you are going to generate $50,000 a year simply for that deposit. You are making money off of money itself. No invention, no contribution to society, no nothing. That being denoted, if you are a lower or middle class person who is limited in funds and must use credit cards and get interest-based loans to buy your home, then you are paying interest to the bank, which the bank is then turning around and using, in theory, to pay the person's return with the 5% CD. What the bank is basically doing is stealing from the working poor to pay the leisurely rich. Simply put, the social stratification we see in the world today is maintained and guaranteed by the monetary system's underlying mechanisms. That reality aside, let's return to the subject of the so-called business cycle. When money is added to the money supply, that money is then typically put to use for some reason. Very often these reasons include starting a business, buying a home, investing in the stock market, etc. This increase in the money supply often translates into so-called economic growth and hence the boom period of the business cycle. Unfortunately, money cannot be added to the economy indefinitely, for the debt and inflation caused by the expansion will eventually overcome the growth benefits. When problems begin to arise after periods of monetary expansion, such as rising debt levels, slowing people's desire to take on new loans, the central bank and government regulators have basically 2 choices. They can either, 1, attempt to continue the expansion by infusing even more money, often by lowering the interest rates, making credit cheaper, or 2, let the contraction, hence recession, run its course, raise the interest rates, and bring the economy back to some kind of equilibrium. As far as history is concerned, the pattern has been for them to do both, basically with the idea being to ease the recession by increasing liquidity. The reasoning is simple. It is politically unpopular for the ruling class to have unemployed, poor citizens. This can lead to contempt for leadership and instability. Therefore, there is always the game of placating the public with false security in order to avoid the truth coming out about the inherent dysfunctionality of the monetary system itself. The result of this easing of the contraction simply delays the inevitable, and since the U.S. government has eased virtually every contraction period since the Great Depression by infusing more money into the system, a doomsday scenario likely awaits. The big contraction, and it might be happening right now. As noted earlier, money cannot be added into the economy indefinitely, for the debt and inflation caused by the expansion will eventually overcome the growth benefits. This is what is now happening on a massive scale, and no intervention to ease this crisis is likely to work. Why? Mainly because the debt levels are way too high. The total debt of the U.S. government plus its citizens' private debt was about $53 trillion in 2007. This is simply an absurd amount of debt. The total U.S. money supply, M3, was only about $12 trillion in 2007, while the annual GDP of the U.S. was only about $14 trillion. Unfortunately, there is very little the U.S. government can do to stop this large contraction if they adhere to the tenets of the monetary system. Even with the insertion of tens of trillions of dollars, it cannot compensate for the imbalance. Plus, if they did this type of liquidity injection, the result would simply exaggerate the stagflation we are now seeing, where inflation and economic stagnation occur simultaneously. 2. The ultimate outsource. Now, in response to these issues, very often people suggest monetary reform as the solution. These suggestions often include going back to the gold standard, outlawing interest, shutting down the Federal Reserve, giving the power of printing money back to the government, etc. While these reforms and others all pose logical merits to a certain degree, they do not recognize an overshadowing, little discussed phenomenon that has accelerated since the 20th century, nullifying the monetary system in and of itself: the replacement of human labor with machines. At the core of the economic system itself is the mechanism of labor for income. Our entire economic system is based on human beings selling their labor as a commodity in the open market. If humans do not have the option to work for a living, then the monetary system as we know it is over. No one can buy goods if they don't earn money. Companies cannot afford to produce if the consumer has no purchasing power to buy anything. As John Maynard Keynes disdainfully pointed out, we are being afflicted by a new disease, of which some readers may not yet have heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor outrunning the pace at which we find new uses for labor. While politicians, business leaders, and labor leaders bicker over issues they claim are responsible for the growing unemployment in the world, such as foreign company outsourcing or immigrant labor, the real cause is going unaddressed in the public debate, and that is technological unemployment. Since market capitalism is built upon the logic of reducing input costs to increase profits, the inclination to replace human labor whenever possible by machine automation is a natural progression of industry. After all, a machine doesn't need to take breaks, it doesn't require health insurance or benefits, and it isn't a part of a demanding labor union. A simple glance at U.S. historical labor statistics by sector shows the pattern of machine automation replacing human labor definitively. In the agricultural sector, almost all traditional workflow is now done by machine. For example, in 1949, machines did 6% of the cotton picking in the South. By 1972, 100% of the cotton picking was done by machines. In 1860, 60% of America worked in agriculture, while today it is less than 3%. When automation hit the U.S. manufacturing sector in the 1950s, 1.6 million blue-collar jobs were lost in 9 years. In 1950, 33% of all U.S. workers worked in manufacturing, while by 2002 there was only 10%. The U.S. steel industry from 1982 to 2002 increased production from 77 million tons to 120 million tons, while the steel workers employed went from 289,000 to only 74,000. In 2003, a study was done of the world's largest 20 economies, ranging from the period of 1995 to 2002, finding that 31 million manufacturing jobs were lost, while production actually rose by 30%. This pattern of increasing productivity and profit, coupled with decreasing employment, is a new and powerful phenomenon, with no changes in sight. So this might beg the question, where have all those jobs gone? The service sector. From 1950 to 2002, the percentage of Americans employed in the service industries went from 59% to 82%. For the last 50 years, the service sector has been absorbing the job losses from agriculture and manufacturing. Unfortunately, this pattern is slowing fast as computerized automation takes hold there as well. From 1980